welcome to another episode of OsbornePro TV. Today I'm going to be showing you how to install and configure Active Directory certificate services on a Windows Server 22 operating system. I'm going to cover a couple of things, such as a little bit into capacity planning as well as naming conventions. If you don't need this part of it, you can use one of the sectioned off areas in like the timeline of the video to jump to a different spot. Starting off, I named my domain controller USVC1-DC01. This is an attempt to create a naming convention that's scalable. US is the country, VC1 is vCenter 1. You might also change this to like a data center 1 or Azure instance 1 or AWS instance 1. Then I like to do -role and then the priority number of that role. So domain controller 1's my primary domain controller. DCO2 would be my secondary or my failover, things like that. So I've named this computer already and rebooted it. It currently is not a member of a domain. We're going to look at that next. In fact, let me open up a new Notepad instance so we don't get distracted by something else there. All right, so that's our naming convention for the device. Use whatever makes sense to you. Now, as far as domain goes, there's two different ways to name your domain. You can either use, if I'm using OsbornePro.com, that's my publicly available one. If there's a split DNS issue where people internal to your network, if this is your main Active Directory domain, people internal to your network are not going to be able to access your public site when this is set as your Active Directory domain. So you need to fix that by either having two separate ones, such as OsbornePro.org being internal and then OsbornePro.com being external. The way Microsoft recommends doing this is creating a subdomain, and we could do it either by location, such as COS for Colorado Springs.osbornepro.com, or I could do it by like site, so main, like mainoffice.osbornepro.com. And then I would be able to create a separate DNS zone for osbornepro.com in the DNS records and set the appropriate SOA values and things like that, which we'll get to. Since this is the way Microsoft recommends it, this is the naming convention that we're going to use. We're going to use a subdomain and then use osbornepro.com as an allowed domain and set OsbornePro as our net BIOS value. That way people, when they sign in, they can use OsbornePro/username, right? So that's that goal. And before we get into that, there's a couple sizing things I wanted to mention here for capacity planning. If you have one DC that's going to carry your load, we'll assume it has a max of 10,000 clients with at least a 1 gigabit network adapter attached to it. View that as your max. So for every 10,000 clients, you want connected to a DC. If you have more than that, start spreading them out. So if you have 15,000 clients, you should have 4 DCs with this N+1 scenario. You can create read-only domain controllers. However, that's typically going to be used for, I think they recommend it for like satellite networks or small offices where you have maybe somebody with minimal IT experience, things of that nature, where you just need to speed up authentication because somebody's at a remote site, just a couple people there, and nobody's really messing with that DC. So we have our DC+1 for redundancy. The database volume, they say to assume 40 kilobytes to 60 kilobytes for each user. So that way you can determine the size of what your storage and database volume is going to be. Your network, they say at least have 1 gigabyte because most traffic is going to, you need to be able to handle that kind of traffic for authentication and things of that nature going to and from your domain controller. And CPU, they say for every 1,000 concurrent users at a core. And the size of your volume should be calculated by the database size plus 20% or 500 megabytes, whichever is higher. So whatever your total users times these kilobytes is, add another 20% on that, or 500 megabytes, whichever is greater. For your NTDS DIT file sizing, for existing domain controllers, the volume of the database folder should be the size of the current NTDS plus 20%, and or 500 gigabytes, whichever is greater, and that matches, kind of what we just covered here. And then estimate your storage at 300% of the NTDS DIT file. So for your disk size, 300% of the NTDS DIT file. This is to accommodate growth and potential need for offline defragging. And then with our network bandwidth utilization, just something to be aware of is when you hit 60% of the bandwidth utilization on the NIC, then the failover DCs start being used. And another thing to take into account is the log volume, or the size of the logs. And we'll just do these so you can kind of see everything I wrote here. The volume of the log file should be the size of the combined log files plus 20% of the combined log files, or 500 megabytes, whichever is greater. In smaller environments, I guess you could get away. I saw them say, as a rule of thumb, provide at least 500 megabytes. However, following benchmarks from STIG and CIS, your log files are going to be larger. So with your maximum total log size for all logs is 16 gigabytes. That's probably a safe value for most small to medium-sized businesses, and not ones that are, tens of thousands, say. And yep, so that's just a little background on some capacity planning for your DCs. Next thing we want to do is install the role and feature of our domain controller. So I start from here. So I click Add Roles and Features inside Server Manager. If you're not familiar with Server Manager, it probably opens by default. That's the icon for it. And all right, so now we have our Add Roles and Features updated here. We click Next. Leave it on role-based or feature-based installation because we're not setting up an RDS instance. Select from a server pool. Basically, we have the one server here that we're installing this on, so we can just keep that selected and click Next. We want to tick the box for Active Directory domain services, and this automatically selects other snap-ins and such that we need, or other features that we need. And we want to include management tools if applicable, and click Add Features. The other thing we need to add is a DNS server. Microsoft recommends this as a best practice, and your DNS and ADDS role should always exist on the same server. So we can click Add Features. And I guess the exception to that, you could say, would be if you're creating a read-only one, or if you're something that's not your backup or secondary, where you just have it performing that function. But as far as your primary and failovers, they should have your DNS server and ADDS services installed. Now we're going to click Next. And we're going to click Next again because Group Policy Management was selected from the previous screen, and probably a couple other things. And we can click Next through this. And Next again. And we're going to tick this box. I don't think it needs a restart, but we're going to allow it to restart anyway in case it needs it. And it's going to install all these services. So I click Install. When this finishes, all of those services for Active Directory are going to be set up and ready to go. Another thing with domain naming conventions, you do not want to use fake domains. Microsoft best practices tell you to use a TLD or a top-level domain, which means a legitimate domain like .com or .org. .lan, .local, .corp are not legitimate domains. Don't use them. You're not getting any security from them because they're not publicly routable, because your things are not publicly routable anyway. It creates issues with all kinds of services, like if you're using Bonjour in your environment or MDNS. Apple appends .local to all of the devices that are on the local network with that. And if you have a .local domain, you're breaking the Bonjour service. All right, so this is finished. Now we can move on. Next thing we want to do is promote this server to a domain controller. Since this is the first domain controller, or the primary domain controller we're creating, it's the only one in the environment so far, this is the one I want to promote. And this is going to be a brand new forest. So my root domain name is going to be, as I mentioned before, we're going to go with main.osbornepro.com. And this is the Microsoft recommended way, is to have a subdomain. So that's our forest. We'll click next. And the forest function level is kind of the ability of the last time Active Directory, say, was updated in some way. So Server 2016, basically nothing's changed in Active Directory since Server 2016. So we'll leave both of those values selected. We're creating our DNS server, so we've installed that role already, and we're creating a global catalog because this is a forest we're creating. This DSRM password, that's basically safe mode for domain controllers. Since there's not really a such thing as a local account on a domain controller, this DSRM password allows us to boot into, say, safe mode and perform repairs on the database if we need it. So set a strong password here, which I am not doing because I want to remember it just in case. So you would set a secure password here and keep track of it in whatever your password manager is. If you ever need to safe boot your DC later, you can do, you would sign in using the following method here. You would do // as administrator, and then whatever your password is to sign in. And don't save. All right, so that's that. And we want to create, it's a delegation, authoritative parent zone cannot be found. All right, so I haven't created my DNS stuff yet, so we're going to click next and we'll come back to that. For our NetBIOS domain name, we're going to set this to OsbornePro because I don't want it to be main, because that doesn't look right to users when they're signing in. We want them to just see the parent domain of everything. So this is going to be make it all caps, OsbornePro, and click next. And the next section is a little different. So because the SYSVOL volume is creating dynamic data, it's a good idea to actually have this on a separate disk. It also plans for things being more scalable. There's a couple things associated with this as far as like synchronizing with read-only domain controllers. Instead of using the default FRS, I think is what they call it, you can use DFS. Maybe it's DFSR or something like that, which is a better sync method. It has some advantages to it. But yeah, so you can put this SYSVOL on a different drive location. So if I were to mount in File Explorer, say a D drive or an E drive in here, I could save that the SYSVOL location of that, and that way I'm overwriting the disk on that partition and not on the same disk that the operating system is booting from. It's going to allow your domain controller to last longer, and yeah. But since I don't have one of those, we're okay just keeping it this way. In smaller environments or even medium-sized environments, it's still probably okay to keep the SYSVOL folder. But imagine, rewriting to the disk 10,000 times every time. You have 10,000 people in your environment. They all change their passwords. All those changes end up being a lot. All right, so let me click next. And we can click next again. This is just a review of all our settings. And after this installs, we should have basically all of that set up. We're going to move on to the DNS records after this. And warnings are fine. All prerequisite checks are complete. We click install. And another thing I did not mention is the IP address of a domain controller. We of course have to set statically because we don't want that to change. If we were to set this in here, I like to use something based on the port, like of a service that's offered. So like 153, port 53 is the DNS service. I like port, I like setting that as 53 there. And this is about to restart, so we'll let it do its thing. And that way it can finish joining itself to the domain that we just created. And once this comes back up, we're going to take a look at the DNS records and add some of those, and that way we can show how to set the value of the public domain so that we don't have any kind of split DNS thing going on that prevents internal people from accessing our public site. And also, I think we want to set probably an allowed domain or like a login name so that people can log in using username at OsbornePro.com as opposed to username at main.osbornepro.com, because that ends up being a lot of typing over some time. And let's see, another thing we can do here to check services after things come up to verify that everything is working as expected is if you open up services.msc, you can check the ADWS service to make sure that's running. You can check the KDC service to verify that's running, the net logon service to verify that's running, and then the DNS service, same deal. The other thing too is you can verify that your SYSVOL share is being shared, and that can be done with, do I have this up? I don't know how much you can see here. Bring this down a little bit just in case. And you can do get-smb share name SYSVOL, and you should be able to see if it's sharing that. This is my local computer, so you probably see more like IPC, the admin share, things like that. Okay, and the server has finished booting back up, so now we can log into it, and it's going to be using the administrator account, which you see is now appended with the domain OsbornePro. And then because we set it up with the subdomain, if I open up Microsoft Edge, which I made sure to take care of the prompts beforehand here, and we go to OsbornePro.com, we can see the site. This is the public site, and it loads right up. So that takes care of that part of it, and we don't have to worry about setting records internally. So if I go to Tools DNS, currently I have this as my main subnet. Shit. Let's change that setting back just so you guys can see better. Settings 150. All right. So that's our subnet. We want to create a reverse lookup zone for this because they're not created by default, and you want to have a reverse lookup zone because you may need to resolve an IP address later on that you didn't get the DNS name of, or you couldn't remember what something was. Also, if an attacker is inside your environment, you can get their hostname because it registers with the DNS depending on how you set things up. There are benefits to it, and I don't know any disadvantages to it. I mean, this is inside your network. All right, so we'll create our primary zone. We want to store it in Active Directory because this is our main forest domain controller. We're going to do this to all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this forest, which is main.osbornepro.com. And that's because any spoke domains off of this, we want to use, this as our primary domain. Other site locations are still going to view this as the main source of authority. That's why we want to do that, so they can resolve things at different offices, right? IPv reverse lookup zone, yes, we're using IPv4. And then for our network is 192.168.137, and notice it reversed it in the pointer record. We'll click next. Allow only secure dynamic updates. I did another video on securing dynamic DNS, which I'll have at the end of this video that you can click on if you wish to pursue this further. And then we'll click next and finish. And now we have our dynamic DNS records here. So anytime we create one, or anytime a record gets created, the inverse reverse lookup gets created also. I also do not need to create a forward lookup zone for OsbornePro.com as we saw before, because that's handled by the public DNS provider. If I had set up even if I did OsbornePro.org, I wouldn't have to mess with it. The downside to this part now, let's say if I go to Active Directory, Users and Computers, one of the things we want to do is, actually I'm going to bring this up first. So with group policy management, when you apply things to domains, notice there's only certain OU values here, domain controllers, and your default policy, which is why one of the first things you should do when you open Active Directory users and computers is create a new OU. We'll call it new OU. Organizational unit. Why don't I see it? There it is. And we're going to call this managed. I mean, you can name it something based on your company or anything like that, but managed is usually fine as a good general one. And then you create sub OUs under this that you apply group policies to. So you might create another OU here for users, or let's go, let's broaden this. We'll call it one devices for, call one devices. Then under devices, you could do laptops, laptops, and then you'd have one probably for workstations or desktops, and then you'd have one for, say, member servers, and then maybe you have a subgroup on that of like SQL servers. And this is just, we're keeping in mind here group policy assignments, right? So you might assign some group policy to SQL servers. In my mind right now, I'm thinking service accounts. So if I want to set logon as batch file and logon as service permissions, SQL servers have different values than member servers are going to have. So I'm going to have their own policy applied to this OU that I don't want affecting anything else under it. As opposed to member servers where I might have SQL servers adding on to, like in addition to, as opposed to just whatever's set here. So that covers devices. Then I would add another OU for, we'll just call this users. Or we have a CN users, right? This one's going to be OU users. So that's the difference between this, which is CN, and this, which is OU. And also we're under the managed group. So here we would also create maybe service accounts, and we might also create one for, say, contractors, and then we might have one for even different offices, like we could do, say, main office. Granted, these are already sectioned off by domain, so why don't we do by, instead of main, we could just say employees. And then we could have another one for admin accounts, or we'll just call it admins, right? So this is to give you an idea of how you can separate, or how you should be organizing your Active Directory instance after you create it. The reason we create this managed OU and we don't have anything back for is more about the trickle down effect, right? So we want to be able to set something that affects everything, as opposed, that's under our managed devices, as opposed to outside of them. And then this also leaves us with computers and things like that, where we can remove group policies that are applied to a device if we need to, with the exception of domain controllers. Yes, I felt long-winded. All right, so that's all our user accounts there. We covered DNS. The reason for this group policy is now if we refresh this, is there a refresh button? Let's just open it again, right? So group policy management. Now we should see managed and devices and users, and we can apply group policy settings accordingly. Anything else to set up here? If you're going to be using dynamic DNS, you can create a dynamic DNS user under, say, your service accounts. So we could create a user, dynamic DNS. That's the other thing we're doing. User Logon Names. So we want to create acceptable ones there. So we can go to do, where was this again? All right, so what we're going to do here is we still need to add the acceptable login name. So for example, where is it? We have, oh, it's built in. Where's users? Users, administrator. We want our logon account here is, we only have the option of main.osbornepro.com at the moment. So what we need to do is go to Tools, Active Directory, Domains and Trusts, And then if we right click on this and select properties, we can add alternative UPN suffixes OsbornePro.com and hit add, and then we hit OK. And then we can close this out, and I don't know if we need to reopen this or not, we'll find out. But, there we go. So now an acceptable login name here could be administrator at OsbornePro.com. And that way your users don't have to type out at main.osbornepro.com every time they do something. So now when we create an account, like if I were to create a dynamic DNS service account, I would go to new user. I could call this dynamic DNS, and then we'll just call this one like din DNS, and we'll use osbornepro.com as the login name. Next, set a password, and then user can't change, it never expires, and next, finish, and now we've got our account. And our login name is with @OsbornePro. So your users don't know the difference even though you're using a subdomain. And yeah, so that is how you can set up Active Directory directory services. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you like the video, give it a like or subscribe. Thanks for watching.